All right, welcome to the Cold War, the United States and the nuclear age. So let's go ahead and get started. At the end of the Second World War, the Allies were hoping to make a lasting peace, but mistrust between the Soviet Union and its Western allies made this goal very difficult to achieve. Mistrust grew into hostility, but actually never became a hot war, so actual shooting war. Instead, it was a Cold War fought with words and propaganda, with competition in weaponry, science, and culture. To gain influence among these nations, basically, they kind of restarted the whole idea of chasing an empire. This way, creating their own spheres of influence through culture, weapons, and science. Going after some of the new independent countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had different philosophies about human rights, economics, and politics, and their battleground was basically the world, where they competed for favors, prestige, and control. So what made the Soviets so weary of the West? One is that the communist theory was that capital nations were their enemies and they would spread communism all over the world, so that worried these capitalistic countries. Since coming to power in 1917, the leaders of the Western democracies, such as the United States and Great Britain, saw the Soviet Union as a threat to their way of life. They supported the White Russians, or the Tsarists. We talked about that during the Russian Civil War. The U.S. landed troops on Russian soil, and the Russians figured that maybe the West was going to come after them and really invade. They were kind of afraid of that. The United States didn't recognize the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics until 1933. And the dictatorial police state policies of the Soviet Union differed quite a bit from the democratic ideals of the West. So some of the origins of the Cold War were the Tehran Conference of 1943, and that's where the idea was floated that the Soviet Union come into the war with Japan after the defeat of Germany. They also floated an idea of opening a second front in Eastern Europe, but Stalin quickly said no to that because he was fearing that the Allies would gain too much sway over Eastern Europe, which he wanted to create as his buffer zone to the West. At the Yalta Conference, by that time, most of Eastern Europe had been liberated from the Germans by the Soviets, and Stalin claimed that Eastern Europe was going to be, like I said, his buffer state. It was important to the Soviet Union's security. Basically, for centuries, invasions to Russia came through Eastern Europe. Napoleon, the Germans in World War I, the Germans in World War II. So he wanted to have some sort of control of that region. Roosevelt and Churchill disagreed with Stalin, and it was finally agreed upon that free elections would take place after the war was over. At the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, Stalin continued to assure the Allies on the Eastern European issue that they would have free elections after the end of the war. So after the Potsdam Conference, the Grand Alliance between Great Britain, France, United States, and the Soviet Union begins to fall apart. Stalin forgets that he forgets that he said there was going to be free elections. Instead, he installs dictators that back the communists in the Eastern European nations of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Communist movements take over the governments of Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Albania. And the Western Allies are quite angry about this. Truman condemns the takeover. Churchill speaks about an iron curtain falling, dividing the free and democratic West from the East, now under totalitarian rule. They just fought a war against totalitarianism, and their ally was always a totalitarian, and now he's proving it. Not all of these Western or Eastern European nations were obedient to Stalin. Some of them, after they take over, would learn or would rise up against the Soviets and be put down by the Soviets as well. But once this basically started, you had your Eastern Bloc countries, which were under the control of the Soviet Union or allied with the Soviet Union, and the Western Bloc, which was basically the nations of the West. And basically the world was divided once again into two separate camps. So you have the division of Germany. The Allies basically divide up Germany into zones of occupation. Berlin, the former capital of Germany, is also divided into zones. Berlin is inside the inside the Russian zone of occupation. So you can see here on this one map, you have West Berlin and East Berlin. You can also see that Berlin is well within the borders of East Germany, which was the Soviet zone after the war was over. So to get to Berlin, you would have to go through the Soviet zone. The Soviets didn't want the Allies there, so they basically came up with a plan on how to get the Allies, the French, the Americans, and the British out. Once the Cold War started, you basically had West Berlin kind of join into this one economic zone for the West to show how it was better in the West. And also you have Germany divided into their zone, the British zone, the French zone. So even you have West Germany, which was the occupation zones. So now you have two separate Germanys, West and East Germany, both fighting over basically how things should be. So you have the Truman Doctrine. Now the Truman Doctrine was created by Harry S. Truman, and he brought this about because there was an expansion of communist rebels backed by the Soviet Union trying to basically take Greece and take it under control of the Soviet Union or be in that sphere of influence. So to combat that expansion of communism, Truman announced that any free nation trying to resist being taken over by another power would receive economic and military aid from the United States. This is the Truman Doctrine. It was just one part of the policy that was created by George Kennan. He also came up with basically another part of the Truman Doctrine was containment. Basically, what he was believing was you had to contain communism, so keep it where it already was and don't let it spread. Also, another thing that they used to combat the spread of communism was the Marshall Plan. It was proposed by the former head of the Joint Chiefs and Truman's Secretary of State, George Marshall. The plan was a broad plan for economic assistance aimed to help Europe recover from the destruction of World War II. Now we know from Germany in World War I there was no Marshall Plan. They had to repay their debt. After this, where they see the rise of communism, the Soviet Union is the biggest kid on the block in Europe and the strongest, and the British and the French weren't as powerful anymore because they had fought so diligently and hard. They couldn't afford to rebuild all of Europe, let alone their own country. So the United States, coming out of the war, one of the richest nations in the world, decided that they, in order to basically keep another war from starting, they would help rebuild Europe. So Marshall knew that if the economic conditions didn't improve, that the communist revolutions would soon take place in Western Europe. The Marshall Plan was actually offered to all of Europe, but Stalin and the Soviet bloc refused. The Truman Doctrine, the containment policy, and the Marshall Plan were successful. By 1948, the communist rebellions in Greece, Turkey, and Iran had been defeated, and Western Europe was well on the road to recovery. So in June of 1948, the Soviets decide they are going to get the Allies out of East Germany and cut them off, basically in their little island inside of communist territory, which was West Berlin. So they cut off Berlin from the western zones of occupation. Basically, Westerners are trapped within the city. The plans of the Soviets were to force the Western Allies out of Berlin, and the Soviets would take it over. But instead of caving in, the United States begins what is known as the Berlin Airlift. And basically, they were flying supplies into Berlin that they needed to survive, and basically negating the Soviet blockade. Now, the Soviets, instead of shooting the planes down, which they could have because they were flying over their territory, allowed them to fly in, not wanting to escalate the situation. In May of 1949, the Soviets reopened all routes into Berlin, and by June of 1949, the Western Allies had established the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. In response, the Soviets create the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, basically dividing Germany into two nations until 1990. This is really the first battleground of the Cold War. On West Berlin's side, it got so low on what they had for food or what they could survive on that people were rationed to 900 calories a day. I don't know. Does anyone out there think they can survive on 900 calories a day? Considering I think a Big Mac is over 1,200 calories just in a Big Mac. So imagine a Big Mac a day, and that's it's the only thing you get to eat. Pretty crazy. So we will continue on with the Cold War in our next segment. So I will see you over there.